Okay, so my name is Jan, and this is my colleague Mats, and we're going to talk about effective hypermedia APIs with JAX-RS. So if you ever wondered how to pronounce this word, it's pronounced Hypermedia APIs. Okay. So, the first thing whenever you hear a REST presentation or talk about REST, there is this discussion about theory and practice. You have the professors on one end discussing, the detailed theory, and the practitioners that want to get things done. So if you Google for every discussion about REST ever, you'll find this hilarious video. And we've taken some excerpts from this to just highlight some of the problems. So the developer, he's really happy. He says, check out my API, it's totally RESTful, and the developers love it. The professor says, cool, what media types does it use? And the developer says, well, I use JSON, because that's pretty easy for the clients to parse. Oh, but how are you handling the hypermedia constraint? Then what now? And the professor says, you fool, using hypertext as the engine of application state, you'll never achieve internet scale decoupling without it. And from then on, the discussion spirals out of control, with the professor arguing for writing RFCs and creating internet standards, and the developer just wants to get things done, starts his startup, and makes a lot of money. And the professor is really unhappy. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Is this on? Yes. So let's start about talking or saying what we won't talk about in this discussion. And since this is an advanced talk, we won't be introducing REST. We won't be discussing nitty-gritty details on the protocol, such as differences between these verbs. We won't go into discussing however interesting this media type is, or even be discussing if this should be its name. And unfortunately, we won't provide a simple recipe for doing these hypermedia APIs, but discussing how we should do them and what we've done. So, yeah, we'll talk about practical hypermedia APIs, definition and how it's used, and we'll outline with our experimental framework we've been developing and using. And lastly, discussing the possibility using JAX-RS 2.0. A little bit about our background. We come from a company called J-Way, which is a Scandinavian-based software consultancy company located in Sweden and Denmark. And we've both been working, a little bit about J-Way first. It's a consultancy company we do software and pretty much do anything from embedded software to back-end to front-end, let it be web clients or even clients installed on devices such as Android and iOS. So really a full range of software. And in terms of REST, we really have both ends, both the construction of REST APIs and consumption of REST APIs. We've both been working as consultants for more than 10 years, so and mostly working on back-end, so we've done a lot of REST, of course. And then a couple of years ago, I started working on a project called Streamflow, which is an open source case management tool, and it's implemented in a framework called G4J. They're both Java-based. And both Streamflow and G4J is implemented by or driven by a guy called Richardson, a Java champion. You might have heard of him. And part of the Streamflow application exposes a RESTful backend. And Richard had some really great ideas on how to provide framework support for REST, making it really easy to implement REST. And that was really very inspiring to work with. But as a consultant, I had to move on to new projects, and I started on a new project, and that was also implementing a REST backend, but now in a more plain Java context, not in a G4J context. The framework G4J is really, even though it's Java based and an application framework, it's very advanced, and syntactically it doesn't really look like Java. It has constructs like mix-ins and stuff like that. So it's very good, but it's very advanced and not really something you just pull in on your project. And I was working on this new REST backend and wanted to do these principles, but I couldn't really take the whole G4J framework in. So I talked to Jan a little bit, and we decided to let's try to implement these ideas for the REST framework in a standalone Java environment. So we did a framework called Forest, and implementing these ideas, and it was really quite effective and successful. Yeah.
Okay. So during this presentation, we will use have an example domain, and that is a web shop for ebooks. And the thing with ebooks is that you don't have to wait for them to be delivered to your door. You can actually download them directly. There is no need to have a shopping basket or things like that, so it's a really sort of simplified domain. So that's why we use it here, because it's to sort of avoid all the complexities that arise, in a normal purchasing flow. And the thing you can do on this site is you can, of course, view the books. You can view information about the books. You can query for the books. You can browse for the books. You can find the books, obviously, and you can download the books. So that's sort of, we will use this domain throughout the presentation. And whenever you talk about REST, you hear about something called the Richardson maturity model, and this describes sort of how RESTful you are. And at the level 0, the bottom level, sort of where SOAP is located, at that level you only have a single verb and a single URI. So you simply, all communication is done typically through POST and to some URI. At level 1, you start using different resources for different things. You might have a book resource, or a purchasing resource, or a downloading resource, things like that. But you still don't use the different verbs for what they are supposed to be. At level 2, you use the different URIs, and you also use the different verbs for their meaning. So you use get when you want to access the information without modifying anything. You use put when you want to replace the contents of the resource. You use delete when you want to remove things, and so on. And you also use the different status codes for what they are designed to do. And within the context of our presentation, we will only consider HTTP as REST. We won't consider our other protocols, although that would be possible as well. So if we take a look at the current version of JAX-RS, and the 1.1 version, we find things like at path, which we can use to have different URIs for our resources. We have all the different verbs, and we can put them on our resources to expose how to access the resources. And we can also very easily use the status codes. So we think JAX-RS is a really good standard, and we like it a lot. And it fulfills all the needs you have up to level 2 in the Richardson maturity model. But of course, there is a level 3. At level 3, you have something called hypermedia controls. And what this means is that you have in your response, typically, you have in your representation, you embed links. And this is something you all know about when you browse the web. Because when you browse the web, you get an HTML representation, and you have links inside of that, and you can navigate the links. So it's sort of that simple, really. And there are many ways to represent links. You can have them in XML, JSON, and you can have them also in the HTTP header, so there are many ways to represent that. So if we take a look at what is a link, what are the parts of a link? obviously you need to have some kind of target where the links point to. So what happens when you click the link, what resource is accessed. If you look at the HTML, you often have a description also for the humans. So we can read a link and we can understand what happens when I click the link. But for a program to know what's going on, you need to have some kind of semantic information. The program needs to understand what happens when the program does something. Let's say you have an iPhone client, and the developer developing the client needs to know what happens when I follow this link. So you need to have some kind of information. Usually that's done using something called the rel, and that describes the relationship between the current resource and the target resource. Also, you can have things like what kind of media types you support. Let's say you can put something to this resource. Maybe you want to describe what kind of things you can put. You can also describe what kind of methods you expect or support. So when you look at this rel thing, which is really, really important when we want to do Hypermedia APIs, we want to know, the clients need to know what is the meaning of the link. There is a standard for this, of course. And you can find the standard at this Ayana has the registry of all these standardized links. And they include things like items. You can have items in a collection. You can point things to a collection. Because let's say we have the book example again, you might have a specific book, and that is part of a collection of books. And the collection of book points to the books, things like that. So there are many rels that are standardized, but most typically they are standardized for things like blogs and document repositories, wikis, things like that. So there aren't really many standard rels that you can use when you want to implement a specific service, like a web shop. So the professor says, well, that's no problem. Just write an RFC and you can create your own standardized rels. It's really, really simple. But of course, in reality, we want to get things. We can't wait for things like to other people to approve our ideas. We need to get them out facing our customers as soon as possible. And that's possible using we don't need to have the standard rels. We can start using non-standard rels. For example, you can use a URI as a rel, or you can just make up your own things and hopefully standardize them later. Often that's more pragmatic to do that. Okay, so how does an application that's built using a level 3, how does that look like? Well, it looks like something like this. You have a number of resources, and you have a number of links between the resources. And when the client accesses, let's say, the root resource, because that's the sort of documented resource that the clients normally access the first time. What happens is that the client gets a representation of the root resource and a number of links. We get the links to the books you own and the books that are available in the web shop. So let's say the client and this is of course the rels that are specified here. So let's say the client follows the available link. The client gets a representation of all the books that are available, and maybe one link to the book 1, 2, 3, and obviously many other links as well, but also maybe a link to another collection of the most recently added books or something like that. The client decides to follow the specific link to book 1, 2, 3, and we get, of course, a description of the book, and the author, the title, the price, things like that. And depending on if we have bought this book or not, we get a link to the payment resource, or we can get a link to the download resource. But we won't have, the client wants to have the information, what links are available, what links can I follow. So if the client hasn't bought the book, there is no meaning to have the link to the download, because we can't download the book until we have bought it. So let's say we haven't bought the book. We need to buy it first. There is only a link to the payment. We follow that, and we'll go into more details later on. And after fulfilling the payment process, we can download the book. Oh, let's see. Okay. Okay, so one interesting thing here is that I never said anything about what URIs were available here. And for the client, the URIs doesn't really matter. The client doesn't care what the URIs are. The client doesn't care if they are just, randomly generated characters or nouns, verbs, whatever. The client doesn't care. It just follows the links. So this could be a scheme we could use, but we could use any other scheme as well. From the client perspective, it doesn't really matter. We should use a scheme that is appropriate for our purposes on the back end. And we should be free to choose the scheme we want. Okay, so this thing that I said was pronounced Hypermedia APIs. It's an acronym for Hypermedia as the engine of application state. What does that mean, really? So the way I look at it is that is the application state. That is from the point of view of the client. So let's say I have accessed the book 123 resource. I have retrieved the information about the book. I get the link to the payment resource because I haven't bought the book yet. And I decide I want to buy this book. I follow the payment link and end up in the payment OK resource. So now the state has changed. So now I have bought the book, and now I can download the book. So that is the engine here. That's the link. You follow the links, and the state changes. What resources you are currently located at changes. So if we compare the level 2, which is, I consider there are many useful level 2 services. So I don't consider level 3 the only option. That's fine to do level 2 services as well. For example, Amazon S3, it's a very good level 2 service that doesn't contain any links, but it's still very, very useful. But let's compare it from the point of view of the client. So what about navigation? At the level 2 application, the client needs to know how to build the URIs. So the URIs are really, really important for the clients. It needs to construct them somehow, using maybe some parameters or some other rules or something, I don't know. But in level 3, you just follow the links. The links are available there, and you just follow them. So if we look at the behavior, what behavior is available? Let's say we take the book example again. If the client should be able to display the download button, if you want to download the client needs to know, can I download the book or not? At level 2, you need to have some business rules in the client, so the client knows what to display or not. But in level 3, if the download link is available, you can download the book. So let's say you have maybe you want to give away a book for a certain day. If you have a level 2 application, the clients must be know that you have this campaign going on, because it needs to know about these business rules. But in level 3, you can just add the links, and the client will show the download link if it is there. And of course, the professor pops up again and reminds about his ideas. So let's have a look at how this can look like.
Yes. So we'll take this example and see what it looks like implemented in the framework I mentioned, we call Forest. But let's, instead of starting looking at the code, let's look at the result. So we take a browser. Yeah. And yeah, so now, as Jan said, we document the root URL, of course, and we enter that in a browser here. And Forest supports two different media types built in, either HTML or JSON. And when you load or reference a URL in a browser, it will ask, or it tells actually in the request that it prefers to read text HTML. So our framework will then say, okay, I'll give you HTML. So that's a HTML representation of the root resource we have. If we would take curl in a browser, I've actually already done it here, but just for, if I do it again, so I curl the same URL, and then I put it into a prettifier for the JSON just to make it more easy on the eye. But we see here the result. It actually returns us some JSON with the same link as we had here. So here it understands that this is actually when, if you know about curl, when you just curl it like that, it doesn't have a accept header set. But our framework then says the default media type is JSON, so it will give you JSON. But of course you could also add and say I want to accept JSON, and it will work like that. So two different representation of the same resource. But let's browse it using HTML in a browser. That's a little bit more easy. So looking at the root resource here, it just writes, and I mean this is it's not considered a real client. This is only for browsing or discovering your API. So it looks like an ugly website, and it's not really anything but to browse your API. So what it does, it looks at the resource, then generates this, first of all, the fully qualified class name. And then it lists the links in different groups. We only have one group here called Subresources. So yeah, we have the books we talked about before. So I'll follow that by clicking it. And now, of course, the URL changed. It changed to appending this books / on the URL. And we see a different different resource now called books resource. And it has a query called discover and a list of sub-resources. And this books resource is a collection of books. And then the framework knows, oh, this is a collection. I will start listing the elements in this collection. Here we only have 2 elements, but you see it really has built-in support for paging all these links, so it doesn't write the whole collection at once. It pages it nicely, and also you can sort them by name, for instance. You can sort them differently. Okay, so let's follow a link again. Let's take the first book, and we go to another resource now. It's with the ID. This is very common way of doing this. That you have the collection name and then the collection or the item ID here. And this is called book resource without the S. And we have a query called read, and we have a command called by. Then it also writes the description. That's because in our framework we've said that this is a readable resource, meaning that it implements this read operation, and meaning that the framework will just include the result of calling read here just for convenience. But really, if we press this read, we could actually see that it does it like that. It writes the JSON, and now the browser has a plugin that prettifies the JSON, but it's just the same string actually returned. Okay, but we have a command here called buy, so let's try following that. And then we get to a page where it says, okay, before you can buy the book, you have to enter your PIN code. So this is a sort of a mock-up of a purchase flow. And I will enter my secret PIN code and press submit. And it says operation completed successfully. Fine. So if I now go back to the same resource again, and this is unrefreshed because I just pressed back. So if I press refresh, you'll see that it actually changes now. It has different links. Of course, still it's readable. That's not changed, but the buy query or the buy command is not available anymore because I've already bought it now. But now instead I can download the book. So if I press that, I supposedly see the content of the book. Okay, so I mean, that's a Hypermedia API. So how did we implement this? So we go back to the slides here to see the code. So so you see here in the top corner, you see a little snippet of the graph to show you where we are, and then at the bottom, a description of the links it shows. So this is the root resource. In our framework, you must, if you're a resource, you have to implement the interface resource, which is just a marker interface, but an interface as part of the framework. And then, of course, you have to tell the framework when you initialize it that this is a root resource. It's not because it's called root resource that it will act as a root resource. You tell the framework this is the specific root resource. And we have a method called books returning a resource, and then the framework knows, okay, this is supposed to be a sub-resource of this resource. Just returns a new instance of the books resource. So moving on to that one. As I mentioned, that's a collection. So we implement the framework interface collections resource, and then you can specify what is it a collection of, and in our case it's just a collection of links. Then you need to implement these two methods called item and discover. So item is the specific item in the collection, and that's fairly simple. It works as a sub-resource. Remember, we saw the books and then the ID of the specific book. So that works as a sub-resource to that one. The method called item, it takes the ID and then gives us the book resource with that ID. We'll get to that in a minute. But then you need to implement a method called discover that returns a list of links. And I mean, we've commented out the code here, but presumably it does a lookup in the repository and returns a list of these links using this links builder. Okay, so the book resource, the final one, is just a resource, and it has a constructor now because it needs to know the ID of the specific book. And again, we've commented out the actual code because it's not relevant here, but you do some kind of, again, lookup from the repository based on the ID, and if the book is not found, you throw a 404, meaning not found, something like that. Otherwise, you assign it to your local variable book, and then you have these two methods down here, buy and download. Okay, so first of all, under the hood, how does this actually work? Because what we did in the framework, we chose to have a concept of command query separation to distinguish commands from queries. You remember you saw it listed it in different groups. Either the method was in the queries group or in the commands group. And the command query separation is really a big topic, so I won't cover it here. But basically it says that your method is divided in two different categories. Either it's in the queries category or in the command category. And if it's in the queries category, you're allowed to return something, but you're not allowed to change the state of the application. And if you're in the commands category, you're allowed to change the application state, but you're not allowed to return anything. And if you think about these two kind of things, it's really similar to what get and what post means in HTTP sense. And if you think about it with the return or not returning thing, it's really easy to write a framework that recognizes if a method is a query or if it's a command. So basically we just look at a method and say, if it returns void, well then it must be a command, and then it must operate on post. And if it actually returns something like the download, which returns an input stream, it must be a query, so it must be get. So in that way we sort of avoid, with just this simple convention, we avoid polluting our code with these annotations, these verb annotations. But okay, so the by, if you look at the by method, you see that it actually has a pin DTO, so an argument. Now one step back here, because now I just said that the by method will be post. But if you think about following a link in a browser, it's always HTTP get. So how does this actually work? So let's go back to the browser. And we just turn on, we just go back to the list here and we turn on, we just turn on the console here to see what's actually happening. Resource network, yes. Okay, because what I just told you means that if I follow this link, here. So now we're on the other book, which I haven't bought yet. So I have the by command ready. But as I said, following this link will be HTTP get, and how does that work then? So if you notice down here, you see the response code. It actually says 405, meaning method not allowed. And what method not allowed means is that it says to you that the URL you're using is correct, but the verb you're using is incorrect. And that's what we see. We used get. So, and we should have used post because it was a command. So it says 405, that makes sense. But instead of just breaking or saying, wrong, it actually helps you. So it generates a response here based on the method you were invoking. So it looks at the method and say, oh, you're actually expecting a pin DTO. So using reflection, it looks at that class and generates a form based on that. And the form, or if you look at the pin DTO class, it contains one field called pin, which is a string. But the framework is general, so it could really be arbitrary, complicated, and nested objects and all that. It would just generate an appropriate form. And the form can then be submitted, so it resubmit to itself, or it submits to itself, and that is using post, of course. So now the verb will be correct, and also the input parameter will be correct. So that's how you sort of discover your API. You don't need to document this, it's just given to you. So when I do this and then press post, the URL is correct, the verb is correct, and we get a success. Okay, but what about... So the next thing is that the links are not enabled at the same time, and that's the whole point of this Hypermedia API, that you change your state and then you change what you can do, what links you see. So we needed some kind of constraint here. And how do you typically do constraints? Well, it's probably something like this, that when you call a method, you start, the very first thing you do is that you validate, you do some validation, input validation, or whatever you do. And if that is not valid, you'll throw an exception. And then, below this should of course be the implementation of the method. But if you think about that approach here, that's not really good enough, because we need to know, before the method is invoked, we need to know, is the constraint valid or not? So the quick fix here, the easy solution to a constraint, is not really good enough. So we chose to do it like annotations. So you could imagine now that you have a constraint called has bought book, and you can say it's either has bought it or has not bought it with this boolean. And basically, so the framework has a constraint annotation built in that it knows when it sees that annotation on something. So this has bought book annotation will extend from that framework constraint annotation, and that will evaluate to either true or false. And based on that, the link will be visible. And we've actually implemented this much like the bean validation is also happening. So doing this on the code will actually do exactly what I just showed you. It's really easy to read here and figure out, when is the one link enabled and when is the other link enabled. So that's really good. Okay, so that was fairly easy to do. Let's try to evaluate. There are quite some advantages of this, of course. You saw that the discovery and the documentation is basically for free. You just implement your resource tree, and then you just say to the developer or whatever, here's the root URL, and just browse the API. You can see how you invoke methods and what input parameters are needed, and all that. You don't need to write a lot of documentation on how that works. Also, the conventions gave us very clean code. You don't have all kinds of annotations in the code. It's basically Java code and very readable. And the declarative constraints really are a huge benefit, because that's what Hypermedia APIs are really all about, being able to enable and disable links all the time depending on the state. So let's ask, what does the developer think about it? And he's really happy, because it's really easy to use and there's no extra work for him to do this Hypermedia stuff. That was the issue in the beginning. But what about the professor then? Is he happy? Yeah, he asked about other media types. I said that we only have HTML and JSON, and of course he wants the whole general package that you can define your own media type, for instance. We couldn't do that, and rels, we don't support that in general, at least. So, however cool it is, we have some disadvantages also. Very basic HTTP support, media type wise and header wise and all that. You have to restrict yourself to only using JSON and simple things. You also had very limited control as a developer. If, for instance, the serialization mechanism was baked into the framework, you couldn't change serialization provider, for instance, if you wanted to do that for whatever reason. And also the linking mechanism. We saw that these child links, as long as you append to the URL, meaning that it's child links you're doing, it's very easy to do. That's built in the framework. But general linking in the resource structure is not very easy to do. And as we saw in the diagram that Jan showed, it was really, you could have links anywhere. So concluding, Forest, it was a really great experiment and it served us well. We've used it on several projects and we've showed it to some of our colleague developers and they love it and have actually used it on other projects also. It gave us a lot of ideas on how to do that, and it turns out that the problem is it's not really general purpose. You need to have this media type flexibility also if you want a general Hypermedia API. Yeah.
Okay. So we started to think, how can we do this in a more general purpose way? And since we said in the beginning we like JAX-RS quite a lot. So we started looking at how can we do this using JAX-RS. Is it possible? Well, using the current version, it's not really possible because you have a bit limited access. But there are some interesting opportunities coming in JAX-RS 2.0. So we want to take a look at those. So the first thing that happens in JAX-RS 2.0, and we saw that in the keynote yesterday as well, and there is Hypermedia support, and that is the class link. You can add links to your resources, and you can add links to your representation. And this is, this is sort of mandatory to have an Hypermedia API, so this is very good. So let's ask the developer if he's happy with this. Now he can add links everywhere he wants. So let's ask him and see. He starts thinking, and then no, this is not enough because he will have to add these links everywhere in his application, and that will be too much work for him. So he won't bother doing that. That's our theory, at least. So how can we make it easier for him? We think you need to have these 4 things to get a good Hypermedia framework. You need to have this idea of a single root resource. That's very important if you look at REST from a theory perspective and also from a practical perspective. You need to have support for this rel attribute at the links. You need to have some kind of links by default. And our idea is that every resource, every URI in your application should have at least one link pointing to it somehow. There should be one link somewhere pointing to every resource. So we need to come up with a strategy how to build that. We think this idea of having declarative constraints is also a really good one. We need to have this. So let's go through this and see. But first the professor pops in, and of course he thinks we should all program HTTP directly, but that won't be very productive, so we won't do that. Okay, what about the single root resource? Using JAX-RS, this is actually supported already. And when you annotate your class with the @path annotation, that resource becomes a root resource. The sort of problem I see is that you can have multiple root resources using JAX-RS. But this is already supported. We can use this, and we can add subresources by adding an @path annotation without a verb. So we can have subresources in the same way we have in Forest. So what about rel support? Well, adding an annotation where you can specify the relationship isn't sort of a hard idea to come up with. The question is, of course, what is the relationship to what? And the way we see this is that you have this the root resource here, and the path is just / for this one, and the relationship is for that URI. So you specify the relationship to that URI. And then what you do is you group your methods in different resources, and the things that are in the same resources, they have the same link, the same relationship. So let's look at a more complete example. If we have this buy down here, and that has a relationship of payment to the book resource. Yes?
Is rel JAX-RS annotation?
No, it's not. So I'll go through later on what. So the question was if rel was standard, and it's not, and we'll go through what is standard or what we're showing here and what is not standard. So let's say you want to add links automatically. The links method here, that's part of the JAX-RS standards. You can add links to your response, but the make links is not part of that. But you can imagine implementing a framework method that takes an object using reflection, looks at the different paths and the rels, and generate links isn't that complicated. So we can actually do that. And if we do that, we will get something like this. We will get a link with a payment rel to that URI. However, we need to be able to construct absolute links, since JAX-RS doesn't really support relative linking very well, since the slash in the end is optional. So we need to add this as well. And suddenly, you can imagine if you have to add this to all your methods, it gets a bit messy. So we probably don't want to do that. But in JAX-RS 2.0, one of the new things that comes there is a way to control how things using some kind of interception mechanism. So there is something called a container response filter that is you can make that be called after the representation has been generated. And you can imagine implementing this, and all this would do is call the make links method and add the links to the response. So what about the declarative constraints? As Matt showed you before, the idea is very similar to Java Bean validation, so we could just sort of use the concept of Java Bean validation, but instead of validating the return value or validating the parameters, we would evaluate if the method can be called or not. And we need to evaluate this before the method is executed. And in 2.0, we get this container request filter that is called before the request is made. So we can filter things before they're actually called. So okay, the things that exists in JAX-RS 2.0, it's the link class, it's the container response filter, and the request filter. The things that are needed, either as a future part of the standard or as a separate framework, is the rel annotation, the constraints, and the possibility to generate links using reflection. So we get these sensible defaults that I was talking about.
Yes, so in conclusion, we saw that using these hypermedia ideas, as Jan outlined in the beginning, really simplifies the client development. You don't need to duplicate all the business logic on your client. That's a huge advantage, and really that JAX-RS 2.0 really provides the framework for the foundation for doing this, but there's still a little needed. So we believe the minimum thing you really need for a framework like this Hypermedia Framework, is to have sensible default links added. That's the basis of it.
But we know that many of you are developers and you want to have a look at this now. So you're asking, where can I get hold of this thing? And if you do, you need to keep in mind that this is an experimental framework and it has a number of drawbacks. But sure, it can still be very useful. And you can find it at GitHub. You can download it, you can try it out. There are some samples there. The documentation could perhaps be improved.
No, it could be improved.
Yeah, it could be improved. Okay.
Comes with the plugin for like struts or something?
If it comes with a plugin for struts? No, this is only a backend framework. You should implement if you're building a front end, you need to implement that separately. So the way we typically build is having clients using Backbone or jQuery, things like that, at the web side, calling the REST resources. So, any more questions?
You demonstrate happens in the case that the method needs input parameter, and there it's for 5 and this form plus in response. What happens if you don't have HTML as a response form? The JSON you can't.
Yeah. What happens? What happens? Okay. What happens if we don't have HTML as the response format and you do the method not allowed? Well, it actually provides a JSON representation of a form. It's I mean, it's no standardized, but it's at least something you can work with. So there is support for that as well.
Do you persist everything? Is there an underlying data model behind the engine? Or is it just in session state?
Okay, so if we persist anything or if it's just session state, no, there is it's just a session state. Or I mean, if you want to handle things like security or authentication and things like that, that you have to build separately.
So you can't really come back into a session that you kind of abandoned later, try and come back midstream into a workflow.
No, there is.
Then like the has both you wouldn't know unless you actually persisted there.
No, you need to have some kind of authentication mechanism, connected to this so you can implement the has bought book somehow. Yeah. Yeah, but that's not supported. There's nothing in the framework for that. What we typically do is have things like Spring Security on top of this. Yeah.
Did you use Spring for doing the annotation processing and just the listeners and stuff like that?
No, it's built using. We built that ourselves.
So apart from security, are you using Session for any kind of state management?
No, the framework is completely stateless. Yeah.
And do you use this is your own implementation of JAX-RS 2.0 or using Jersey or some other framework behind the scenes?
No, the current version of Forest is completely not related to JAX-RS. We built it originally using JAX-RS, but we have no dependencies to JAX-RS right now. But who knows? Once the JAX-RS 2.0 comes out, maybe there will be a new release of Forest.
So the stuff you showed at the end was just where you're going next?
Yes, exactly.
So if I'm using a backbone to pure concept for them, but if I don't have the construct URL, how do I figure out how to build my front end to call certain action?
So how does the client figure out what calls to make?
Yes, because if I have a backbone front end, I will need the construct URL to figure out how to type to my manual.
Yeah. Okay. So the way you would do that is, you would hopefully be able to use, build your client using the rels, and use those to drive your client. But of course, you can, and we have seen developers browsing the HTML client that we showed, and then sort of hard coding all the URIs in the client, which we don't think that's a good idea, but it can be done, of course, that way as well.
So basically, this framework pushes all the behavior to the service side. So the client is just basically HTML.
I didn't get the last part.
So for example, this framework encapsulates all the logic and basically send to different representations instead of having a UI control the specific actions.
Yes, exactly. So all the actions that are available are exposed as links, and the client only needs to follow those links.
So if you have a link, how do you know what operations you can perform on it?
So how do you know what kind of links you can perform on it? Well, as we showed you, there is, you can add, and some people do this, you can add what methods is supported on the link. But also, the rels, you need to document the rels, what the rels mean. So let's say you have some kind of payment rel, you need to document what that means. And while you're documenting that, you can, of course, document what methods are available as well, and what media types are supported. So the way...
You're talking about general documentation, or
Yes.
in the code somewhere, so that, let's say you go to a head and it shows you
Yeah.
the format. You can do that.
Yeah, you could of course do something like that. Yeah, we have been thinking about adding things like options. And you can sort of get more metadata about the service that way. But that's nothing we have experimented with. Sure. More questions? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess you've used it when you did the command query separation. Have you found people, developers and things like that, accepting of that as far as the limitations or the constraints that does it make them happier? Because I could just see, if you have a hard and fast constraint like that developers may or may not like it. Just wondering what their feedback was.
So the question was developer feedback on using CQRS style command query separation. Well, I think initially most developers find it hard to use that because it's completely different because what they're used to. So I definitely see it takes some time to accept that style.
So did you have to give them any? Because it forces them to 2 steps.
Yes.
Things and just having that as being a hard and fast rule. Well, I guess it's nice that's built into the framework because then they know how to.
Yeah, exactly.
So using this pretty new paradigm, query versus command, are you kind of hiding what HTTP verbs are being called from the developer? Like they still have to.
No. The way we see it is that this is a convention, and the convention has been like if it's a command, that should be a post. But using JAX-RS, when we move ahead to JAX-RS, you can of course override the defaults. So the convention might be there or may not be there, but you can override the conventions using annotations. And I think that is a good idea to have good conventions that are true most of the time, but then you should be able to override them when you need to.
Does your framework forces that, or?
No, the framework, as we said, is experimental. I'm very much want you to know that, and it enforces these constraints. The void methods have to be post, and the other ones have to be get. But we also support put and delete and things like that, but using slightly different approach.
You said you did use the delete. Is that just an animation?
No, we have an interface that we implement. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, so if we don't return anything, well, the actual command implemented by the application doesn't return anything, but of course the framework returns something. Yeah, sure. With the post.
Do you do puts?
We have support for it. Yeah.
There is a debate whether or not you're supposed to return something.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious where you guys fall.
I don't know. I don't think we have an opinion.
No.
We're starting to reach the professor side, I think. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.